Welcome to Pacific States University's online lecture series for BBA 202 Economics for Business. Today, we are diving into how humans make decisions in the face of scarcity and how these choices shape our global economic systems. We are going to establish the overarching themes of this course, laying the absolute fundamental groundwork that will guide us through every subsequent module. We live in an era of absolute information overload. Every single day, we're bombarded with choices. These range from the moment you wake up and decide what to have for breakfast, all the way to complex, life-altering decisions. Maybe you're thinking about adding a double major to your degree, or perhaps you're observing a massive corporation deciding whether to open a brand new factory overseas. We have to make all of these decisions based on the information available to us, through streams, sponsors, and social media giants. Economists actually call this operating under imperfect information. Because, let's be real, we rarely have all the perfect data perfectly organized right in front of us. Yet, we still make hundreds of these decisions daily. What happens in the broader economy is deeply, fundamentally affected by how well, how accurately, and how fast this information disseminates through our society.
Here is the roadmap for our lecture today. We'll start with the problem of scarcity, move on to dividing the labor, then compare micro versus macroeconomics. After that, we'll look at models and the circular flow, how we go about organizing the economy, and finally, the globalization era.
Section 1. The problem of scarcity.
So, what exactly is economics? If you were to go out and ask the average person on the street, they'd probably tell you economics is just the study of money, or finance, or maybe just incredibly boring mathematics. But that is a profound misconception. Economics is not primarily about money or business at all. It is both a comprehensive subject area and a highly fundamental way of viewing the entire world. At its very core, economics is the study of how humans make decisions in the face of scarcity. It's a highly developed, rigorous framework for understanding choices and information processing. Every single time a family decides whether to buy a new car or take a vacation, or a town chooses whether to fund police and fire protection over a new school system, or a nation debates environmental protection versus national defense, that is economics in action. We are continually, endlessly weighing our options because, quite simply, we cannot have it all.
And this brings us right to the core issue of our entire discipline: scarcity. The formal definition here is the fundamental condition where human wants for goods, services, and resources exceed what is actually available. If you look around carefully, you will immediately see that scarcity is a universal, undeniable fact of life. Resources like labor, tools, land, and raw materials exist in a strictly limited supply. Think about the physical limitations of our world. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, back in 2015, the total labor force in the United States contained over 158 million workers. The total land area was roughly 3.8 million square miles. Now, yes, those are absolutely massive numbers, but they are definitively mathematically finite. There is a cap. And of course, the ultimate scarce resource, no matter who you are, is time. Whether you are the richest person on earth or the poorest, you only have exactly 24 expendable hours in a single day. That's it. That's all you get to earn income, acquire goods, enjoy leisure, or simply sleep. When you combine these hard physical and temporal limits with the fact that human wants seem to be virtually infinite, the problem of scarcity becomes very real and honestly very urgent. If you ever doubt this, just consider the stark reality of homelessness. Seeing people sleeping on park benches is a very visible, very tragic reminder that scarcity is real, and it brutally dictates who gets access to essential goods like food, shelter, and healthcare.
Because scarcity is such a massive, pervasive societal issue, we desperately need ways to measure it. We can't just talk about it abstractly. Data is critically important in economics because it allows us to empirically describe and measure the exact issues we are actually trying to solve. Throughout this course, we are going to heavily utilize the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank's FRED database. Now, what is truly staggering about the FRED database is the sheer, mind-boggling scale of information available. It tracks nearly 400,000 domestic and international variables over time. It gives us empirical, hard data on everything from money, banking, and finance to population and labor markets. We can precisely track national accounts like gross domestic product, prices, inflation, and even hyper-specific regional and academic data. Having access to this massive, constantly updating repository of numbers is a game changer. It allows economists to step out of the realm of philosophical debates and actually see how scarcity and economic activity are playing out in real time across the globe.
Section 2. Dividing the labor.
Let's trace the intellectual evolution of economic problem solving. How do we actually combat this massive problem of scarcity? The formal study of economics truly began with a man named Adam Smith, born in 1723. While others had definitely written about economic concepts before him, Smith was the very first to address the subject in a comprehensive, systematic way. In 1776, he published his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations. This book fundamentally changed how humanity views production and wealth creation. Fast forward to the modern era, and we can see how these foundational ideas have evolved into highly rigorous, data-driven interventions. In 2019, economists Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, and Michael Kremer won the Nobel Prize in Economics. It's a fascinating journey. We went from early philosophical observations about factory workers in the 18th century all the way to experimental, deeply empirical methods specifically designed to alleviate global poverty in the 21st century.
So what was Adam Smith's brilliant, world-changing observation? It was the concept regarding the division and specialization of labor. Instead of one person trying to build a house, grow all their crops, hunt, and repair their equipment all by themselves, which, as you can imagine, is highly inefficient, tasks are divided. To illustrate this, Smith deeply analyzed a pin factory. He counted 18 distinct tasks required to make a single, simple pin: drawing out the wire, cutting it, straightening it, putting a head on it, packaging it, and so on. He observed that one worker doing all 18 tasks independently might make 20 pins in an entire day. But a small business of just 10 workers, where each person specializes in just 2 or 3 specific tasks, could produce an astonishing 48,000 pins in a single day. Why does this happen? Smith offered 3 distinct, powerful reasons. First, specialization allows workers to focus exactly where they have an advantage. This could be due to their education, natural talent, or even geography. For example, it is much easier to be a massive wheat farmer in North Dakota than in Florida. But it's far easier to run a sprawling tourist hotel in Florida. You play to your geographic and personal strengths. Second, specialized workers dramatically increase their speed and quality over time. Think about an assembly line worker, a software developer, or a heart surgeon. They become incredibly fast and highly innovative by focusing their entire professional life on one core competency. Practice doesn't just make perfect, it makes highly efficient. Finally, the third reason is economies of scale. As the level of production increases, the average cost of producing each individual unit declines. A small factory producing just 100 cars a year faces huge average costs per car. But a massive factory producing 50,000 cars, they can utilize highly specialized machines and thousands of specialized workers to drive that average cost down to a mere fraction of the original. And we really must remember that understanding these efficiencies has profound real-world stakes. Economics is not just chalkboard theory. It is a vital, active toolkit to solve critical human puzzles. Take the massive issue of widespread poverty and educational barriers. Global governments spend billions upon billions, yet deep structural problems persist. This brings us back to Esther Duflo and her colleagues who won that 2019 Nobel Prize. They realized a fundamental truth: you cannot simply throw money at a massive structural problem. You have to break the widespread problems into smaller, manageable pieces, experimenting with small, specialized interventions to thoroughly test what actually succeeds. As Duflo beautifully stated, like the war on cancer, the war on poverty was not going to be won in one major battle, but in a series of small triumphs. Her experimental, highly specialized methods prove that economics, when applied rigorously and patiently, can lead to real, tangible improvement in the lives of hundreds of millions of people.
Section 3. Micro versus macro.
Economics covers immense intellectual ground, so to make sense of it all, we divide it into 2 complementary perspectives. Think of studying a complex biological ecosystem, like a vast lake. Microeconomics is like the biologist who focuses on the specific individual organisms in that lake. They're looking at certain kinds of algae, the unique characteristics of a particular fish, or the daily diet of the snails. In economic terms, microeconomics focuses strictly on the actions of individual agents. It looks at how individual households spend their weekly budgets, whether specific people work full or part-time, how a single firm decides what exact goods to produce, what prices to charge, and precisely how many workers to hire. It's zoomed all the way in. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, is like the biologist who takes a massive, overall view of the entire lake ecosystem from top to bottom. They aren't looking at one fish. They're studying what eats what, the broad environmental stresses affecting the water quality, and how the whole system ultimately stays in balance. In economics, macroeconomics looks at the economy as a whole. It focuses on massive, broad issues: the growth rate of national production, the overall percentage of unemployed people in an entire country, the inflationary increase in prices across the board, government deficits, and national levels of exports and imports. You literally cannot fully understand the lake without both views. The micro decisions of individual businesses are heavily influenced by the macro health of the overall economy, and the macro performance ultimately depends on the culmination of millions of individual micro decisions.
So how do governments actually manage that macroeconomic health? There are specific governmental tools used to constantly pursue goals like standard of living growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. These fall into two primary categories. First is monetary policy. This is conducted by a nation's central bank. In the United States, that is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve utilizes highly specific policies that affect bank lending, interest rates, and financial capital markets. When you hear about interest rates going up to fight inflation, that's monetary policy in action. The second tool is fiscal policy. This is determined by a nation's legislative body. In the United States, this falls to Congress and the executive branch, which originate the federal budget. Fiscal policy strictly involves government spending and taxes. Now, it's highly tempting to think the government can just step in and fix any problem by pulling these two levers, but as we'll see throughout this course, interacting with millions of individual micro-decisions is never that simple. It's a delicate, incredibly complex balancing act.
Section 4. Models and Circular Flow. To understand how economists visualize these immense forces, we turn to John Maynard Keynes, easily one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. He brilliantly pointed out that economics is not just a rigid list of facts to memorize. He wrote, "Economics is a method, rather than a doctrine, an apparatus of the mind, a technique of thinking which helps its possessor to draw correct conclusions." What does that mean for us? It means economists look at the world through a uniquely structured lens. They use theories and models to take incredibly complex, messy, real-world issues and simplify them down to their absolute bare essentials. Just like an architect builds a physical tabletop model of a city block to see exactly how a new building fits into the skyline, an economist builds abstract mental models to test theories about human behavior and resource allocation.
Let's deeply examine one of the most foundational models in our entire toolkit, the circular flow diagram. This model meticulously dissects the entire economy into two main groups, households and firms, and it elegantly shows how they interact across two vital markets. Let's walk through it step by step. The outer circle represents the goods and services market, also known as the product market. Here, firms produce goods and services and sell them to households. The households pay for these goods, and that money becomes the revenues for the firms. But where do households get the money to buy these things in the first place? That brings us to the inner circle, the labor market. Households provide their labor, land, capital, and raw materials to the firms. In return for these essential inputs, the firms pay the households in the form of wages, salaries, and benefits. It is a continuous, never-ending exchange. Labor and money continuously flow in one direction, goods, services, and wages continuously flow in the other. While the real world obviously has incredibly complex financial markets, international borders, and global trade dynamics, this stripped-down model perfectly isolates the essential heartbeat of basic economic exchange. It's the core engine of everything we study.
Section 5. Organizing the economy.
Now, zooming out to a national scale, every single society on Earth must answer some very basic questions. Who organizes production? Who ensures the right number of televisions or tractors are made? And who decides the absolute best way to produce them? Historically and currently, there are three main ways to systematically organize an economy to answer those questions. First up is the traditional economy. This is the absolute oldest economic system, and it is actually still used in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America today. Economic affairs are driven entirely by tradition. Occupations strictly stay in the family, most families are farmers using long-standing historical methods, and you generally consume exactly what you produce. Because things are done the way they have literally always been done, there's very little economic progress or broad technological development here. Next, we have the command economy. Here, economic effort is devoted to vast goals passed down from a centralized ruler or ruling class. Ancient Egypt was a prime command economy. Massive portions of economic life were completely devoted to building pyramids for the pharaohs. Medieval manors were another strict example. In the modern era, communism utilizes command economies, where the government centrally decides what is produced, sets all the prices, determines the production methods, and dictates wages, while theoretically providing necessities like healthcare and education for free. Currently, countries like Cuba and North Korea operate under command economies. And finally, the market economy. This is the exact opposite of centralized command. It is highly, fundamentally decentralized. A market is any institution that brings buyers and sellers together. Think of the New York Stock Exchange. Market economies are driven by private enterprise. Private individuals own the resources and the businesses, supply is dictated entirely by consumer demand, and a person's income is based purely on their ability to convert resources into something that society values. In this system, decentralized market forces, rather than government decrees, determine the vast bulk of economic decisions.
Now, in reality, most global economies are mixed, actively blending elements of command and market systems to various degrees.
To see real-world empirical examples of how these systems are actually organized today, we can look at the 2016 Heritage Foundation Index of Economic Freedom. They ranked 178 individual countries based on 50 different, highly rigorous categories of economic freedom. Things like the ability to work where you want, for businesses to freely hire and fire, and for banks to freely choose who gets loans. At the very top of the list for the most economic freedom, you see Hong Kong and Singapore, with the United States coming in at number 11 and Denmark at 12. At the absolute bottom, with the least economic freedom and residing closest to a pure centralized command economy, you have Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Cuba, and North Korea, sitting at 178. Interestingly, several countries experiencing extreme instability at the time, like Syria and Yemen, couldn't even be ranked because the basic structures were failing. However, it is absolutely vital to note for your understanding that there is no such thing as an absolutely 100% free market. That's a myth. Every market requires government regulations to define the rules of the game. At a bare minimum, you need structural laws to safeguard private property, prevent violence, enforce legal contracts, and prevent massive fraud. Conversely, heavily regulated command economies still relentlessly experience market forces, often manifesting as underground or black markets, where buyers and sellers transact freely but completely without government approval. The market always finds a way.
Section 6. The Globalization Era. This brings us to the modern phenomenon of globalization. We define this thoroughly as the expanding cultural, political, and economic connections between people all around the world. It is heavily, deeply driven by the vastly increased buying and selling of goods, services, and financial assets across international borders. Why has this exploded in recent decades? There are three primary reasons. First, massive, unparalleled innovations in transportation. Container shipping and specialized air cargo have driven transportation costs down to a mere fraction of what they used to be historically. Moving stuff is cheaper than ever. Second, massive leaps in computing and telecommunications. It is now incredibly cheap and easy to manage complex, long-distance economic connections. Furthermore, think about what we buy now. Many modern products are quite literally just information: computer software, financial advice, architectural blueprints, music, and movies. These can be shipped across the globe instantly over computer networks with almost zero transportation cost. Finally, international agreements and treaties have actively encouraged and incentivized far greater global trade. To quantitatively measure the true extent of this globalization, economists often look at the ratio of a country's exports divided by its gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is the total size of production in an economy. So this specific ratio tells us exactly what share of a country's total economic production is actually sold in other countries. Looking at this precise data from the World Bank for 2015, we see some fascinating, slightly counterintuitive variations. Belgium, a higher-income country, exported a staggering 84.4% of its GDP, nearly everything they made went somewhere else. Mexico, a middle-income country, exported 35.3%, brilliantly showing the massive surge of globalization in developing nations. Canada exported 31.5%. But look at the United States, the largest economy in the entire world, sitting at only 12.6%. Why is that?
Let's break this down because it is a very common point of confusion for students. Why does the United States have such a surprisingly low export share compared to a country like Belgium? The answer directly lies in our earlier discussion about Adam Smith and the division of labor. Massive economies like the United States have such a vast internal market, such a massive population, and such extreme geographic diversity that they can actually achieve an incredible division of labor, deep specialization, and massive economies of scale entirely inside their own national borders. They simply do not have to look outside to find a massive market for their goods or to source highly varied materials. They can do it all in-house, so to speak. Smaller economies, however, like Belgium, Korea, or Canada, simply do not have the internal population or landmass to achieve those massive economies of scale all by themselves. Therefore, to survive and thrive, they absolutely must trade extensively across their borders to fully take advantage of specialization.
Now, if an astronaut could somehow look down from space and see all global economic transactions as bright lines, the Earth would look like a glowing, intensely dense ball of interconnected webs. Yet, despite the massive overall economic growth generated by this globalized system, the modern realities and frictions of globalization are intensely complex. In recent years, we have seen significant organized global pushback against globalization. Why? Because while the global economic pie might be getting vastly larger, the distribution of those gains is heavily uneven. Everyday citizens across the world have raised serious, valid concerns over localized job losses as massive factories move to cheaper labor markets abroad. There are deep structural concerns over the loss of political sovereignty to international trade bodies, and there's sharply rising economic inequality within localized nations. We have seen prominent, undeniable examples of this pushback recently, most notably with the 2016 vote in Great Britain to formally exit the European Union, commonly known as Brexit, which was driven heavily by these exact, deeply felt anxieties. The system is wealthy, but the friction is real.
And this brings us to the end of our foundational module. We have zoomed all the way from the micro-dilemma of managing a 24-hour day to the vast, complex macro-frictions of international trade networks. I want to conclude this lecture with a specific thought-provoking discussion question that I want you to actively synthesize for your next assignment. Given the absolute realities of scarcity and the unstoppable interconnectedness of globalization, how should a mixed economy balance market freedom with government regulation to best protect its workforce? I want you to deeply think about the circular flow we discussed, think about the specific tools of fiscal and monetary policy, and rigorously consider how we manage the very real frictions of a globalized world. Thank you for your close attention today, and I will see you in the next module.